Es el turno de escuchar los conceptos de Jeremy Adelman, autor de este libro, que el título está en inglés, pero lo voy a tratar de traducir al castellano, Las fronteras del desarrollo, tierra, mano de obra y capital en los campos de trigo de Argentina y de Canadá. Jeremy Adelman es un historiador, como les contaba, en historia moderna, un experto en historia moderna de la Universidad de Oxford, que estudia la globalización y las economías y el rol de las economías en distintos momentos del desarrollo económico del mundo. Bueno, en este caso, una comparación entre Argentina y Canadá y las consecuencias en el presente argentino. Lo tenemos aquí en la repregunta. Good afternoon, Jeremy Adelman. Thank you so much for being here today in La Repregunta, el especial.
Es un placer. Thank you.
Jeremy, we, as Argentinian, we tend to think that we have been the best of the global world at the end of 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And today we are almost the worst of the world. What happened to Argentina at the end of the 19th century, and which was the Argentinian role in the global economy that, was starting to be the mainstream in the global organization?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that Argentina in the late 19th and early 20th century would have been considered and was by many people to be like Australia, Canada, parts of the United States, a model for a certain type of capitalism. But what happened, what explains why Argentina didn't follow the same pathways as Canada or Australia is a question we've been debating for a long time. I think that the dilemma for Argentines was less the model that they pursued in the golden age than the difficulty of changing from one model to the next model. Mm-hmm. That is, that the golden age was one that was shared by many societies. It's that Argentina had great difficulty managing the transition to a more industrial, manufactured-based system of economy. And in that transition that began in the 1920s and 1930s, it stumbled and created institutions that polarized the republic and made it very hard then to find a stable new model. And then the country just began to oscillate from one model to another model, and nothing appeared to work for a very long period of time, and in the end, by which time Argentines felt like they were having to catch up.
In that golden age that you are mentioning at the end of the 19th century, which kind of model was leading the Argentinian economic development? Is this the Generación del 80 model with the lands and the exploitation of lands in agricultural, the key role for us?
Yes, and it was very dynamic, and there were three components. It was exports of products, primary products, and it looked like Australia and Canada in that respect. It looked like the Western United States. The second was heavy foreign investment, especially in the creation of infrastructure. And the third was large-scale migration. And at the time, all three of those elements worked. And yes, there was some criticism of it. There was some criticism of it also in Canada and Australia. I'm using those as comparison sets because in the late 19th century, that's what it looked like. And that worked. It was a successful model. By 1914, Argentina would have ranked among the top 10 countries in economic output per capita. The difficulty was making the transition to a new model.
I want to go deeper in this first model of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. You have studied a lot of the Canadian model compared to the Argentinian model. Which is the main difference? And Because your main idea just right now is that the problem was the transition from one model to the other. But was there something in the Argentinian model compared to the Canadian model that could be the origin of problems, or could be part of the problems when it comes to change from one model to the other?
Yes. So, Luciana, that's actually the key of the puzzle, the centerpiece, which is that problems were seeded in the golden age that would develop later on. And I would say really two critical components. They were reformable, but together, they were reformable individually, but together they created a very difficult set of circumstances. One was the disparity or the inequality in the distribution of the critical resource that supported the Golden Age, which was land. If you compare the distribution of land in the other export economies, they were much more egalitarian than Argentina's was. So the social conditions for this dynamic economy created a poorly distributed returns from the model. And that meant that later on, when it came to managing the transition, there was much more conflict over who was going to be the beneficiary. The second problem was public institutions. That the Argentine state, and it is connected to the challenges of Argentine democracy before 1912, was not as inclusive as, let's say, the Australian and the Canadian models. Now, I do want to say that the Australian and the Canadian models had their challenges and their problems as well. It does not help to idealize them and to think this was utopia and Argentina should have followed them. There was a lot of inequality and a lot of exclusion there too. But sometimes small differences have big impacts, and it made it easier to have a society that could negotiate the transition from one regime of an economy to another one.
This lack of, the problem with the distribution of land in Argentina, it ended in big estates versus the family of farmers in Canada. This is the idea behind the concept you're developing.
Yes. So you have the large, hacienda system in especially the wealthiest of the resources, which would have been La Pampa, whereas in Canada and so on, they gave it out to small farmers. But there were some very important explanations for this that made a lot of sense at that time for Argentina, which is that Argentina was a mixed or a hybrid export economy. It had grains like wheat, but it also had beef. And the large estate system was very efficient at alternating the land uses. So the ecological damage to that resource was much less severe in the Pampa than in the Canadian or the American prairies. By the 1920s in the North American prairies where they were exporting wheat, that land was being destroyed. Turned into almost a desert by the 1930s. Whereas the complex land use system of the hacienda was actually more ecologically sustainable. So that's why we have to be very careful about, and in fact, increase our model of thinking about the economy to think about ecological factors.
Another idea that we usually discuss here in Argentina is that in those times, Argentina has a specific role in the global trade organizations, selling and exporting raw material, production. Is this a problem in terms of how then the global economy developed, and was there any kind of cost for Argentina in terms of access to technology and to go to a more industrialized and technological model?
Yep. Yeah, it's the challenge is not so much relying on exports as what you do with the revenues that you get from the exports. And so there are two sides of this, and one is whether what we might call in Spanish would be called la renta del suelo, the returns to land were being distributed to alternative pursuits. And that's where the public institutions matter a lot. And that was one challenge. And it was obviously very difficult given the power of the Argentine landed elite over the public institutions. The other problem, which, a very famous Argentine economist, Raúl Prebisch, pointed to, which is that those primary exports will, over time, yield less and less what's called returns, right? So that each quantity of wheat would get lower and lower returns. And that's a very disputed theory, but for the basket of goods that Argentina was selling to the rest of the world, this was going to be a problem when it faced competition from other areas. But the real problem, I think, was that first one that I talked about, the ways in which the returns from the exports were not being used as well and as efficiently as they could have been.
This is a very interesting idea, and it moves the responsibility from the economic model to the political leaders in some way.
Mm-hmm. That's right, and that's so. That's why I refer to the term regime, because it's about a complex relationship between the marketplace and the state and social actors, and you have to have a tripod to explain the balance between those things. Argentina had a balance that worked one way for one model for a certain period of time that had difficulty finding a new tripod. Mm.
But what happened with Canada? Because it's very interesting, this comparison you have been studying for many years, and why the key factor was to Canada being able to move to a more industrial and more higher value economy depended on the politicians thinking how to invest the revenue of exportations. Did it actually work in Canada in those times?
Yes, to a certain extent, that explains the success of the Canadian model, but it doesn't explain everything. For starters, Canada did benefit from being right next door to the United States, which is something that Argentina did not have access to. But going back to the first part of your question, yes, the Canadian government, with a federalist structure, was able to redistribute rents across a broader array of sectors and to invest that into what we might call public goods, especially the education system. Now, the Argentine education system was historically and remains an excellent one. I mean, I know Argentines think that everything is un catástrofe, and there's a tendency to think that everything is going out, downhill all the time. There was an effort to invest in public schools. This was the model of Sarmiento, and it was very important for Argentine identity. But again, sometimes small differences in the investments have large effects over the longer term, and that was one of the important differences between the two. But of course, you have to remember that agro-exporting elite in Argentina was not contributing to the same pool of wealth as the farming sector was in Canada. The farm sectors in Canada was very far away from the capital. They lived out in the prairies. They were not right there in the big city, which is what the case was in Argentina.
Another idea that we are very focused in Argentina is, or at least part of the public opinion, think that this golden age was very powerful times in terms of economic growth, but it was not necessarily this kind of returns distributed equally among population. Is it true, or in general, the wealth of Argentina was better distributed than we usually tend to think?
Yes. Actually, that's a great question, because there is let's say a bipolar way of thinking about the golden age. That is, that it was the age in which everything was working extremely well. Again, it got destroyed later on, let's say, particularly when Perón came to power. That's one narrative. Another narrative is that the oligarchia kept everything for themselves. And as long as they kept everything for themselves, nothing worked. It was not even a democracy, and there were no social programs. The truth is, and that's, of course, one might say a traditionally conservative narrative. The truth is neither narrative. I don't think there are very many historians in Argentina who think that either narrative really explains what happened. In fact, there was a lot of reform, a lot of experimentation, a lot of effort to create public institutions, universities, research infrastructures. That was all there. It just, when the world became increasingly competitive, and there were more and more countries playing the same game that Argentina had been a beneficiary of, falling behind had tremendous consequences over the long run. And when you add the polarization inside the country over which model to adopt, it was impossible to make sustainable alternatives.
It is very interesting what you said about the elite, the agricultural elite, that they usually in Argentina used to live in the main cities like Buenos Aires, but this was not happening in Canada. The agricultural the farmers in Canada did not build an elite by themselves, a social elite, culturally influencers or something like this?
No, and in fact, I would say the wealthy, powerful sectors historically speaking, and actually remains true now, in Canada came out of the banking sector, the manufacturing sector, the services sector, infrastructure in Montreal, and then eventually in Toronto, which became the powerhouse. Those export sectors were thousands of kilometers away. Where Canada had problems was that the grievances of the farmers against the manufacturers turned into a fight between regions. And so Canada has had many more federalist conflicts than Argentina has. And in many times in the Canadian history, there has been a doubt or question about whether Canada would stay together as one country. And there were even plebiscites about whether to break it up. So you can never get rid of social conflict in a capitalist society, but the institutional system directs the ways in which that social conflict moves.
Jeremy, let's come to the present times with the pandemic influencing the way that globalization is being thought today. Because the consequences, we thought that we were living in a very globalized world, but finally when the pandemic arrived, well, it showed that it was a fractured world, according with your ideas. Could you describe this?
We tend now to look back on the world before the pandemic as the glory days of globalization. And in fact, there were problems with that model of globalization well before the pandemic. The tragedy is that the pandemic hit just at a time when the global institutions were exhausted. And those global institutions, many of them had been created after 1945 in one world system that no longer applied by 2016. That these were institutions that had been created out of member state systems, where each member state would work together to come up with cooperative solutions. That worked pretty well as long as the club was small and homogeneous, especially European and North American dominated. But after the liberation of Africa and Asia and the creation of almost 200 member states in the UN, all that international infrastructure really began to become exhausted. I mean, what it took to get an agreement finally in Paris, and it's just tragic that finally we get a climate change treaty in December of 2015, and then boom, Brexit, Trump, Putin, Modi, the turn to nationalism, just as we were finally converging on an internationalist solution to climate change, which is really the dominant issue of our times, was just tragic. Now, what's the role of Argentina?
Yes.
I mean, I don't think that's what's going to happen. I don't think we are going to have what is called de-globalization. The real issue is what kind of globalization we are going to have. No society will voluntarily give up 1/3 of its GDP in order to turn inward and have sovereignty. People, even though there's a rhetoric around nation first, and I'm living in a country where the president makes this rhetoric all the time, in fact, Americans don't want to pay that price. They would like to have all those cheap products from Asia and cheap labor from Mexico and Central America. That's not going to change. The question is, what kind of globalization? Will it be cooperative and inclusive, or is it going to turn into a game being waged by bullies at the expense of relatively weaker powers?
And last question, Jeremy, do you think that an economy like the Argentinian one, based on commodities, no matter if they are from the oil sector or the agricultural sector, has any chance of finally develop, or it is very important to move finally to the other way of development, more industrialized, more applied to technology and services?
So just a couple of quick thoughts. First of all, I think there are differences between types of export economies. When it comes to fossil fuels and oil, I would not bank a lot of the future on that sector. I think Texas is showing us that that's not a route. But in fact, Texas can be a model for thinking about how you can construct high-tech sectors off the renta del suelo. So I think that's the challenge for Argentina, which is not to be anti-export, but rather to think about using the resources that Argentina has strategically. In fact, Argentina's comparative advantage is to some extent in its land. I think the subsoil stuff, oil is not, I think the future is already foretold on that sector, is the land, but also its people. And there, I think the investment in human capital through education and public health, I think we're going to have a global dialogue about this, but in that respect, Argentina is ahead. It has a strong and important middle class. Yes, it's having difficulties because there's very large underclass to support. But that's going to be the ticket to survival. We know that the countries that do best are the ones that educate their citizens the best, all of their citizens.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy Adelman, for these ideas, very interesting and unique ideas you have developed throughout these half an hour. It was a pleasure, really.